Good evening and welcome to the second session of the 6th Tarragona International Environmental Law Colloquium that this year is dedicated to environmental law and the challenges of the decades ahead, promoting transformative and preventative. I just asked confirmation. Okay, that we're registering. Sorry for the interruption. That this year is dedicated to environmental law and the challenges of the decades ahead, promoting transformative and recovery responses to the planetary emergency. The Tarragona International Environmental Law Colloquium is jointly organized by the Tarragona Center for Environmental Law, the CEDAT, and by the Tarragona Environmental Law Students Association, the EDAT. The virtual event is also organized as an activity carried out by the Faculty of Legal Sciences of the Università Rovira e Virgili. My name is Simona Fanni, and I have the pleasure to be the moderator of the section of today. First of all, I would like to welcome and thank all our speakers. It's a big pleasure, and it is an honor to have all of you with us. I would also like to thank all our attendees. It's a big pleasure to have all of you with us and to engage together in the reflection and in the discussion about environmental law and the important challenges that we're currently tackling and all the challenges that are expecting us in the decades ahead in the post-pandemic era. Before we get started, I would like to provide you with some information about the agenda and the structure of the section of today. First of all, we will have our keynote speech that will last 25 minutes. Subsequently, we will open panel 2. Panel 2 is dedicated to all the actions, the measures, the responses that are being defined from the global to the local level in order to tackle with the current critical times that we're living in. Panel 2 will last 4 speakers, 4 panelists, and each presentation will last 10 minutes. I would like to warmly encourage all our audience to join proactively the debate. And for this purpose, you can type your questions into the question and answer section, the question and answer box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. I would like to invite you to specify the name of the speaker that you're addressing with your question, and also your name and your affiliation. You can also join the discussion by using the chat or sharing any relevant information that you wish. I would finally like to remind you that the session of today is now recorded and that you're also online, live on Facebook. But that being said, please let me have the pleasure and the honor to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Dr. Farana Sutana. Dr. Farana Sutana is an associate professor in the Department of Geography, good evening, Farana, and the environment at Syracuse University in the United States of America. Dr. Sultana is also the research director for the environmental collaboration and conflicts in the program for the advancement of research on conflict and collaboration at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Dr. Sultana is an internationally recognized interdisciplinary scholar, and her work, her research, and her publications spans a number of topics. We can recall nature-society relationships, water governance, climate change, post-colonial development, transnational feminism, and decolonizing academia. Farana's work is informed not only by her background and training in the natural sciences, social sciences, and policy experience, but also from having lived and worked on 3 continents, being a post-colonial subject and scholar, and having a lifelong commitment to critical practice and social justice. Farana is author of many publications, and among her most recent books, I would like to recall The Right to Water, Politics, Governance, and Social Struggles, Eating, Drinking, Surviving, and again, Water Politics, Governance, Justice, and the Right to Water. Dr. Sultana graduated cum laude from Princeton University in Geosciences and Environmental Studies and obtained her master's and PhD in geography from the University of Minnesota, where she was a John D. and Karen P. MacArthur Foundation Fellow. I would also like to remind you that Farana was awarded the Glenn Laws Award from the American Association of Geographers for outstanding contributions to geographic research on social issues in 2016. So good evening, Farana, and welcome to the Tarragona International Environmental Law Colloquium. We are so honored and so happy to have you here with us, and we're looking forward to listening to your keynote speech. So whenever you wish, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simona, for that very generous introduction. And hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to join you today at the 6th Tarragona International Environmental Law Colloquium, all the way from upstate New York. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to deliver this keynote talk. So today I want to speak with you about the overlapping crisis of climate change and COVID-19 pandemic that has affected the whole world for about a year and a half, to see what lessons we can learn so that we can foster greater environmental and transformative social justice. So we know by now that many millions of people have been affected by the pandemic, many millions have died, but what we do know statistically is actually probably much lower than what actually occurred, because accurate data collection, reporting, and monitoring of the virus's impacts in many countries were not always fully accurate or available. But what we know as well is that while the pandemic was raging on and grabbed global attention, the concurrent and pre-existing onslaught of climate change continued. It did not abate. So across the globe, with the pandemic, we saw other incidences rise, such as heat stress, wildfires, hurricanes and cyclones, droughts, floods, and sea level rise. These became more severe and frequent, which they have been doing for some time because of climate breakdown. So as communities struggled with both the pandemic and with climate change, what we started to see is that there are some commonalities that we need to understand better. The connections between climate breakdown and COVID-19 pandemic expose the underbellies of structural inequities and systemic marginalizations across places and across scales. And the pandemic brought into sharper relief the co-production of various inequities and vulnerabilities that compounded the sufferings of many over that of others. So what are these differences and similarities of the outcomes? So scholars have written already about how capitalism, colonialism, global racism, and ongoing dispossession have contributed to the worsening of historical climate breakdown, which has, as we know, uneven and very unequal impacts around the world. So when we bring any attention to those differentiated climate injustices, we start to understand the structural and systemic inequities at play. Similarly, with the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic that spread unevenly and unequal ways, we start to see the similarities with climate change in terms of both of them emerged from extractive ecological exploitation, systemic discounting of nature, and the creation of sacrifice zones where profit was prioritized over people and planetary well-being. And it is expected that with climate change, global pandemics that we have endured for the last year and a half will become more commonplace, and they will no longer be an anomaly. So we're at this moment of crises, these overlapping crises. And what we know from scholars of many decades is that crises are moments of rupture, and they're always political and they're material and discursive. But crises are largely approached in apolitical, managerialistic, and techno-scientific ways, instead of looking at the possibilities for crises being moments of change. So what I want to do today is what do we learn from these overlapping crises when we bring in a feminist perspective and a decolonial perspective to look at what can we learn. So when we undertake such a reading of the overlapping crises, it means engaging an intersectional analysis of both of them instead of each one separately, because this allows us to engage greater and sharper focus onto looking at and understanding how different groups, communities, identities, and locations are impacted in similar but different ways. And this thereby fosters more nuanced understandings and explanations, so we don't just rush to reproduce the same types of problems over again. So just some basic context for those who are unfamiliar with the term. In general terms, intersectionality means overlapping oppressions that people experience and the axes of social differences that occur in each context, but generally along intersecting lines such as gender, class, race, ability, age, and so on. It has to be relevant to each place, because social groups are not homogeneous, yet they've largely been treated as such in policies and planning, both local and national and global. So instead, if we bring in an intersectional focus, we start to understand or demand and undertake more nuanced data collection, nuanced data gathering to explain on-the-ground realities of the overlapping axes in more representative and accountable ways. The importance of intersectionality in research are many, but largely because if we pose it in policy language, it's a value added that necessitates disaggregated data requirements, but also gets behind the data, and therefore it can help formulate policies and projects that don't further marginalize people and reproduce inequities. This requires close understandings of local context, laws, processes, institutions, and governance complexities, as well as engagement with insights of evolving bodies of scholarship and theories. So how can we understand the overlapping crises of climate change and the pandemic? While the pandemic is fast moving and had immediate public health crises all over the globe, but unevenly, what we noticed is that this rapidly evolving numbers of mortality, morbidity, and mental health challenges. But with climate change, the health impacts involve what is known as slow violence. It takes time, it's creeping, and people don't often pay attention to it in the same way. But what we're seeing is with increased heat stress, poor indoor and outdoor quality, poor drinking water quality, displacement trauma, and so on, these kinds of issues create public health crises as well. And of course, these are context-driven and they're intersectionally experienced. Not every community member will experience the pandemic or climate change in the same ways. Often the same communities that are hardest hit by both climate change and pandemic are the ones that were already made sacrifice zones from global colonialism, imperialism, and geopolitical injustices. So the lived experiences of those in such frontline communities should help us better understand what is occurring and also therefore help us understand what needs to change in terms of policymaking, which largely takes place among powerful and privileged elite, often in masculine and white spaces. But much of the frontline global communities with regard to both the pandemic and climate breakdown have been communities of color. So this is where gender and race and other factors come into play, as I will explain in just a minute. So what we're seeing is that the disproportionate intersectional gendered imbalances in decision-making and leadership roles in addressing both the pandemic and climate justice exist nationally and internationally. Globally, scholars have written about the trifecta of intersectional patriarchy, pandemic crisis, and climate breakdown, which has exacerbated differential vulnerabilities and multiplicities of systemic inequities that have occurred over different places and across different timeframes. So when we look at a critical approach to climate justice, we look at issues around responsibility, exposure, vulnerability, and ethics, because in order to have justice, it becomes important, or rather imperative, to first identify injustices that exist and then address them in order to reduce the harms that are caused. And climate justice action and research, much like pandemic research and action, necessitates deploying intersectional approaches for comprehensive accountability of the various types of injustices that overlap and compound existing burdens and harms. So if we want to talk about law and justice, we really do need to bring in these kinds of insights from various types of feminist scholarship. And in terms of other similarities that exist across the intersectional outcomes of both climate change and COVID-19, what we've witnessed globally, but in different ways, is gender differences and increased unpaid care work, differential risks and exposures between community members, disparities in access to information and safety measures, increased gender-based violences, exacerbation of insecurity of livelihoods, and financial precarity. Obviously, these manifest differently, spatially and temporally and across community groups intersectionally. But what we did notice is that systemic fault lines were created anew and old ones reinforced. So as a result, how these crises played out differentially across different places helps us therefore understand what needs to be addressed. So for instance, there was a spike in anti-Asian sentiments and hate crimes in the US with the pandemic, and rising anti-Muslim discrimination across the Americas and India and Europe. Health disparities for people of color, especially in settler colonial contexts such as the US, Australia, and Canada, and then obviously issues around ableism and ageism globally, where people who are disabled or elderly face various forms of disparities in healthcare access, and also facing the impacts of climate change and the pandemic. At the same time, precarious workers who are often racial minorities and impoverished members of a community, such as those employed in domestic service, migrant laborers, farm workers, food preparers, were particularly hit hard when businesses shut down or they're pushed out of their job, as well as farmers whose livelihoods became more precarious, not just because of market instability and global economic recession, but with climate change making productivity of land and livelihood with dwindling water sources that much harder. In contrast, wealthier people actually helped spread COVID-19 through travel and also protect themselves by being able to lock down and isolate better. And what happened, as we've known, is that wealthier people generally fared better because they were also using private jets, were also housed in more spacious homes, which relied on greater energy and water sources, and they obviously had better access to healthcare resources. So the consumption and travel by relatively wealthy people across the globe contributed disproportionately to greenhouse gas emissions that exacerbate climate change. So here we start to see multiple issues coming together. So given this, an intersectional lens allows for better understanding of the complex power structures and the lived experiences of those who are coping with and having to adapt to both the pandemic and to climate change. Intersectionality helps us better explain the root causes of inequities, oppressions, and power structures that create the variegated vulnerabilities, risks, and adaptive capacities in any context. So a feminist approach helps us visualize the contours of climate injustices and pandemic injustices in places and across communities, so we can look at how the concurrent crises impact embodied lived experiences, and therefore it helps us humanize both climate change and the pandemic, which are often approached in either techno-managerialistic or in medical ways. So when we look at how communities and households have been able to adapt and cope with these crises, we need to start looking at the oppressed and marginalized groups in each society to understand what are the intervention points. So we see differences in decision-making opportunities and bargaining power within households and within communities with the nation state, differential access to information and resources, and obviously differential asset bases, which therefore compound the vulnerabilities that are intersectionally experienced both individually and communally, but are structurally and systemically reinforced and produced. So what has happened is a lack of intersectionality analysis and resolution can actually result in greater problematic outcomes and reductive conclusions to be made at this critical time where countries and non-state actors and communities are rushing to figure out how to emerge from the pandemic to pick up and do better. So with the rise of increasing need for climate adaptation, resilience, and more research on loss and damage, what we're seeing from that body of research is that if we don't take into account the possibility of doing accountable and transformational research that is justice-oriented with careful and thoughtful intersectional approaches, we can reproduce the same structural problems that gave rise to the concurrent colliding of the pandemic and climate change. So obviously doing this work is neither easy nor is there a consensus, but these kinds of difficult conversations need to occur more rigorously and hopefully without reproducing tropes of racialization, marginalization, patriarchy, and so on. But here's the important point. Just identifying the points of difference and exclusions are the starting point. They are not the end point. The goal is to expand local agency and voice so that marginalized people are heeded and heard in the corridors of power for greater equity and justice on the ground and to usher in the structural changes we need. This includes working with local groups, leaders, organizations, and institutions while paying attention to the local power dynamics to see who is excluded or left out. Because there's patriarchy, racism, and classism that operate in differential ways. So again, it's important not to homogenize communities. So what makes sense in one context may not in another. So there are gendered power relations inequities that make more sense to pay attention to that, whereas in other instances, it may be the historical class analysis to look at differences between privileged and impoverished communities. But we need to understand that these overlap, that patriarchal and classist structures co-produce, and there's a lot of writing that already exists on that. So if we bring those insights to climate change and the pandemic, we start to see how across different geographical locations, impoverished women or racialized impoverished women have definitely dealt a greater harm and have been disempowered in order to participate meaningfully to bring about the changes that they wish to see in their lives. And this is because the different socio-ecological relations of power and dispossession are quite dramatically different based on context. So we need to foreground the complex ways in which social power relations operate in any communal responses, but then also how individual and household level responses. So for instance, we know that gender-based care work burdens increased at the same time, gender-based livelihood, resource-based livelihood challenges increased. So what are the ways we can start to address these issues? But at the same time, we can also be mindful of the fact that there are disparities across global North and global South countries. So there are geopolitical factors involved in terms of ongoing imperialism or geopolitics of development programs to look at how are Indigenous communities positioned marginally compared to settler or dominant communities, or how are various types of groups based on their sexuality or nationality or migrant status, whether they're climate refugees or environmentally displaced households, how are they treated differently and what needs to change? So when we look at these power dynamics and the overlaps and the interplays that occur, we start to pay attention to things that have happened historically and then also spatially and look at these kind of power grids of the production of these harms, but then also what are the resolutions. What we've seen is that people have started to talk about these things and how they perceive their roles in their own democracies and how they enact their citizenship. So state failures or inabilities to provide relief or sufficient social safety nets during the pandemic or adequate healthcare have further weakened societies, but then at the same time have also led to certain kind of authoritarian states to emerge. And at the same time, we see more youth climate activism who are openly calling out global capitalism and consumption habits. So we can start to look at how climate change has occurred historically over centuries, the role of colonialism in it, and at the same time, how climate change is impacting communities, but then also how states function in different places. What we have seen is that the colliding of climate breakdown and the pandemic has shown us these various contours of suffering. And we need to therefore understand and address them better in terms of both responsibilities of state and non-state actors, as well as therefore talk about legal instruments, institutional arrangements, and institutional failures. And what has happened, interestingly, more so in the recent years, but definitely since the pandemic, is the underlying capitalist ideologies of endless growth and ecological exploitation of a finite planet is increasingly being had. Because climate change amplifies and exacerbates and creates new injustices, we need to therefore talk about how the pandemic is very much linked to those capitalist ideologies of natural and human resources exploitation. So this is why that international, interdisciplinary, and intersectional research enriches over our overall understanding of the burdens across sites and scales. And such an approach foregrounds how marginalized groups are rendered more vulnerable, treated more differently, and why critical social justice lens is important. So to not just be caught up in whatever legal or local institutional arrangements exist, but to learn from other places and other sites, to link up a network. Because once we start to pay attention to the contours of these overlapping crises and burdens, we can start to take more critical analyses and understand better why ethical research and interventions become important. So in conclusion, when we talk about radical intersectionality, it means going beyond just analysis and explanation. Because for instance, in one place, a more racialized explanation makes more sense in terms of communities of color versus dominant or white communities. However, gender-based explanation is still important within these communities because global patriarchy exists, but manifests itself differently. Similarly, with class analysis, because there's always differential between wealthier and less wealthy or less privileged people. So we need to start to accept that we cannot do reductive analysis and explanation, but we need to explore opportunities to build solidarities, agency, and collectivities against systemic inequities and oppression, because once we start to understand those differences and commonalities across places, we can start to think about building these solidarities. And this kind of research and intervention offers the possibility to explore strategies of resistance and emancipatory transformations. It also allows for better policymaking and project planning for reducing climate-related harms and pandemic-related vulnerabilities and crises. It also helps us encourage long-term commitments to address structural, societal, and institutional barriers, and it fosters enacting ways to reduce inequities so that we can encourage relationships of mutuality, aid, solidarity, care, and respect. So research and praxis that is intersectional can provide ways to begin to address institutional and structural challenges that compound the impacts of climate change and the pandemic. So what we're seeing now is that a lot of feminist scholars have been talking about feminist politics that prioritizes intersectional inclusion, political leverage, and accountability to create more gender responsive post-pandemic climate change recovery. And what this means is being intentional in having gender just or socially just approaches to look at the processual and material ways that climate and COVID pandemic have intersected and produced various harms that I talked about. But then also to recognize that there are no easy and quick solutions and fixes. We can't just rush in, but it is imperative to first investigate, expose, and understand, and then move swiftly and inclusively to figure out what we can do to reduce inequitable outcomes. So given the increased rhetoric globally in different countries of Build Back Better, as we just saw in the G7 summit that concluded, or the Great Reset for post-pandemic era of climate change that's discussed in the COP, we need to bring in the contextual issues, but then also challenge, what does this Build Back Better mean? Who is deciding? For whom is this for? In what ways? Where is this happening and why? Who is being left out? Whose voices are not being heard? So post-pandemic recovery may not account sufficiently for justice-oriented responses unless it is specifically made to do so. And we need to make it do so now, because countries and nation states are already thinking of institutional and structural changes, or maybe none at all, in their discussions about post-pandemic recovery or post-pandemic climate change actions. So what we've seen as my final point is that many activists and scholars have called for moving away from fossil fuel-based recovery, not just to slow down climate breakdown, but for better post-pandemic fiscal recovery that includes climate financing that is gender accountable, that is environmentally accountable. So some recent examples have been put forth by activists such as the Feminist Green New Deal in the US or the Feminist Fossil-Free Future in the Asia Pacific. So such endeavors would require multi-scalar, gender disaggregated and class disaggregated data collection, greater monitoring and accountability, adequate capacities to be developed, and budgetary resources to be allocated for both their analysis and the responsiveness and the redress where necessary. So approaches like these allow for avoiding generalizations and homogenizations of communities, but focus on power relations and processes and across scales to critically assess which voices count and how or which have been marginalized, and then therefore cultivate the systemic approaches that recognize the importance of intersectionality of these overlapping crises, and therefore the intersectionality of the overlapping recovery process. So if we want to think about not compounding further injustices for a recovery that is more climate just oriented, we need to absolutely think about these issues for more just and sustainable futures. And so therefore, I argue that a greater feminist attention to the interactions of these co-produced but uneven processes of dispossession and crises remain critically necessary at this time if we are to hope to emerge from this with greater transformative justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Farana, for your wonderful keynote speech. It was so inspiring and so powerful. You made us explore a reality that is vital, fundamental, and you really made us explore, and you were enlightening about how crucial and fundamental it is now more than ever to rethink our approach very in depth and to embrace solidarity, inclusiveness, to promote justice, and how a feminist perspective is of so vital importance. I would like to quote an Italian lawyer and professor who said a very beautiful thing, that when he talked to his audience, he wished to ignite the passion for the truth. And today you really ignited a passion for the truth in all of us. So thank you so much, Farana, for your wonderful keynote speech again. It was a big pleasure and a big honor to have you here with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now we're opening panel 2 that is focused on actions, measures, and immediate responses to cope with the current critical times. I have the pleasure to introduce to you our first panelists, Solimar Marta Tapia Martel and Jorge Orlando Llanos Garcia from the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. Today, Solimar Marta and Jorge will share with us the research on challenges of environmental enforcement in Peru during the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Solimar and Jorge. Thank you so much for being with us. We're looking forward to listening to your presentation. So when you wish, you have the floor.
Thanks, Simona. Well, first, good morning and good afternoon with everyone. I would like to say thank you for the opportunity to be here. I consider it's very important to generate this kind of spaces to share experiences in different countries and exchange ideas. So I will start to share. Okay, so the topic I am going to present is the challenges of environmental enforcement in Peru during the COVID-19 pandemic, made by my colleague Jorge Llanos, and who is speaking, Solimar Tapia. First, I would like to share a little about the current situation of COVID-19 in Peru. For example, in the first image, we can see the cases confirmed by department or by regions. And the color or graded intensity indicates where there are more positive cases. For example, in Lima, which is the capital, we have a difficult situation with a lot of positive cases of COVID. And the second image shows the cases until the age 8 of June. For example, the average, the cases in 24 hours, and below we have the count since the start of the pandemic in March of last year. So as you can see, the situation is not the best, but efforts have been made to manage it. Now, what about the government actions or measures in response to this health emergency? Where there is a Decreto Supremo 044-2020 that declares the country a state of national emergency. When the first case of COVID in Peru was confirmed on March 6, and signed on March 16, the entire country went into a quarantine, and only basic services were allowed to operate. For example, in this list, we can see where the essential activities that are permitted: food supply, retail establishment, supply of medicine, pharmaceutical, medical, water, sanitation, electric services, and others. However, as the economic situation of the country began to be affected, as the months passes, the government allowed to other activities to operate, such as the mining and hydrocarbons and electricity, because apport a lot, are very important to the economic to Peru. But we know that these kind of activities have a great impact on the environment. And for that reason, it's necessary that they be constantly monitored to verify compliance with environmental obligation by the project owners. And that contributes to these activities, respecting the 3 pillars of the sustainable development, especially in difficult times for the planet, like now. So we noticed that sustainable development and environmental enforcement are closely related. But what happens if we add to that context of health emergency due to the COVID? Well, we have a scenario which is necessary to continue with expectations, but adopted a new reality, right? So for this reason, then I will show you what tools have adopted in Peru to continue with the supervision activities. But before, I would like to mention what is the institution in charge to environmental enforcement in Peru. The institution is OEFA. Okay, and concerning to transference of competencies to OEFA, now I have a question with what sector does OEFA monitor? Well, we have here a timeline, and you can see how over the years the competences of inspection of different economic activities has been transferred since 2010, like as mining, energy, fishing, industry. And why industry appears too many times? The reason is to that the factory have a lot of activities, different activities. So each year, more and more activities being transferred until reaching the present. And this is are in green because there are still in projection to transfer. And what about the value chains of environmental enforcement? Well, the value chain performance, it could be say that it begins with environmental problem, or in any case, one activity that could have repercussions on the environment. So we have first the resources, the people, the equipment, vehicles, and we need a budget to this. Then we have the activities, vigilance, sampling, field actions, and cabinet, information analysis. And then the products, environmental assessment reports, strategies to promote environmental compliance, directorial or deputy directorial resolutions, and also the normative instruments. And all of that represents the role of the OEFA. But what about the last two? This is possible with the contribution of the EFAs, the entities, environmental control entities, which are distributed throughout the Peruvian territory in each region, and make it possible to have our results and generate a positive impacts in terms of caring the environment. Okay, as mentioned before, if we have the COVID to the disease protection, it generates to have different challenges, but it's necessary to face this situation. And with the use of technological tools, it's possible to continue with the environmental control, such as the use of drones, satellite images, automatic monitoring stations, among others, and that allow having information in real time or generating a chronology of the change and impacts that a space may be suffer as a result of development activities. But something is important to mention that these tools it's necessary that are regulating in the legislation to be clear about the use correctly, and not to infringe the agreements with the project's owners. Sorry. Also, I would like to mention about the result of the follow-up environmental evaluations of these four sectors. To carry out continuously or periodically last year, as in the case of the meaning, we have 5 in total. And this is important in order to see the behavior of environmental components through monitoring stations in order to generate information that allows alerting about possible negative environmental impacts. And to finally, this is the conclusions and recommendations. So the COVID-19 pandemic definitely has had a negative impact on the balance of the 3 pillars of sustainable development. And also continue with the verification of compliance with the legislation guarantees the respect of environmental quality standards and the protection of the environment. And the environmental enforcement has a very important role, since it's intended for companies to comply with their auditable environmental obligations in order to ensure the conservation of the environment and the sustainable use of natural resources. And finally, it's necessary the use of environmental equipment and technologies, such as drones or others, like I mentioned, that allow real-time information to monitor the states of the environment. That's it. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Salima and Marta, for your wonderful presentation. It was so interesting to how you made us explore how, at a domestic level, so much can be done. So the experience of Peru that succeeded to prioritize environmental protection, to shed light and on this dimension, and especially to address the role of corporations, the role of rural companies that is of crucial importance, is such an inspiring and precise perspective. And it was so inspiring also how you incorporate technologies. It was very innovative. So it can be, a very important model of reference also for other countries for improving their approach to the current political times, to the crisis related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and to renew their perspective now and also, of course, for the future. So thank you so much, Salima Marfa, to you and to Jorge for being here, for your fantastic presentation. And now I have the pleasure to introduce to you our next panelist, Camille Vallier from the University of Geneva. Today, Camille will share with us her research on conservation varieties as a legal tool for local and sustainable food systems. Good evening, Camille, and welcome to the Tarragona International Environmental Law Colloquium. We're very happy to have you with us, and when you wish, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organizing committee for putting together this event and for giving me the opportunity to share my work on conservation varieties as the legal tool for local and sustainable food systems. Until the Industrial Revolution, food used to be produced and consumed locally. With the advent of transportation, food has started to be increasingly imported and exported around the world. In addition to the increasing large scales of food trading, the Green Revolution drastically changed the way agriculture operates, shifting from manual and sustainable methods of agriculture to an industrial type of agriculture that generally relies on monoculture, pesticides, and fertilizers. The dysfunctions of our globalized food systems were exacerbated in the spring of 2020. For the first time in a long time, European populations were faced with supply chain disruptions, as it appeared that certain types of food would not be available, or not, at least not in the usual quantities. Switzerland, this is where I live, but more generally, the European Union's dependency on foreign imports for seeds, plant protection products, animal feed, and a good part of foodstuff was highlighted at the time. This situation raised awareness on the fragility of our food systems that were until then seen by many at least as robust. Faced with this situation that was illustrated by images of half-empty supermarket shelves, the European population, has massively turned to farmers' market or direct sales from producers. The need for local and sustainable production became obvious to many at the time. In this presentation, I argue that relocalizing food chain is necessarily implies relocalizing seeds as well. As small as seeds are, they played a key role in the Green Revolution, and they have the potential to influence the entire food production chain. In Europe, seed varieties have to be registered in a catalog in order to be commercialized. It's called the Catalog of Varieties of Agricultural Plant Species. This registration is required by 3 different EU Council directives that each regulate different types of crops. As a result of this mandatory registration, seeds of any variety that has not been registered cannot be traded, exchanged, bought, or sold in the EU for professional purposes. This important limitation was introduced in Europe after World War II, when Europe faced food shortages and started to implement strong measures in order to enhance its food production. The Catalog of Varieties has progressively evolved and is now tailored to meet the needs of an industrial type of agriculture. It contains uniform, high yields, and fragile varieties, which results in the uniformization of crops and of genes. It is, for example, estimated now that agricultural plants have lost 70% of their genetic diversity since the beginning of the 20th century worldwide. This genetic reduction, which is a problem in itself, also implies an increased use of pesticides and fertilizers, which in turn result in biodiversity loss. Conservation varieties are mostly old and traditional varieties, which are now prohibited by the general seed regulation that I just presented. But historically, agriculture was encouraged in a territory, in a particular territory, and seeds were selected to suit the environmental and social needs of a particular region. Conservation varieties were then introduced as a legal category in the European Seed Framework in 2008 as a biodiversity conservation measure. They present two advantages from an environmental point of view. First, they are highly adapted to a certain environment, and thus they require less pesticides and fertilizers in this particular environment than conventional varieties. And secondly, the fact of allowing the commercialization of these varieties curbs the loss of a rich and diversified genetic heritage by conserving those varieties. Seeds of conservation varieties can be commercialized in the EU without being registered in the main catalog, and they represent a way to foster other types of agriculture related to a particular region, to a particular environment, and they are also accessible locally outside of the globalized food chains. Despite this great potential, the legal framework regulating conservation varieties face important criticism. Most studies point out that the limitations are in fact too strict to establish conservation varieties as an efficient tool of sustainable agriculture. There are three main shortcomings that are identified in the system by the literature. First, the quantity of seeds that are commercialized of conservation varieties must not exceed certain limits that are proportionate to the overall quantity of seeds of the same species that are commercialized in the EU. This rule aims specifically at maintaining conservation varieties in a niche and to prevent them from being used in large quantities and to replace patented varieties. Second, conservation varieties can only be commercialized in the region from which they historically originated. But the problem is that their origin is often impossible to determine. And third, conservation varieties cannot be commercialized freely. They must be registered in a separate list, which is not the catalog, but a list still. And the list, the registration requires them to be sufficiently uniform to be described and registered, whereas traditional varieties, by definition, are precisely characterized by their instability and non-uniformity. So this requirement is identified as the main bottleneck of the system, in addition to the fact that this registration procedure is in itself expensive. So drawing on these conclusions, one can affirm that the legal category of conservation varieties, as promising as it sounds, is in fact the result of a compromise, but remains entrenched in a model of intensive agriculture. In my opinion, the category of conservation varieties was actually adopted as a safety valve that was introduced in 2008 to prevent the whole legal system from being challenged. So, so what are the options or the solutions that one can imagine after having come to this conclusion? Conservation varieties do have a great potential to reestablish food production locally. The shortcomings that were identified all had to do with the rules that are limiting their effective use, and therefore it seems necessary to remove these legal obstacles, and two possibilities can be identified in this direction. The first option one can think of addresses the quantitative limits. Just as a reminder, I told you before that the quantity of seeds of conservation varieties that are commercialized must remain under a certain limits in order not to compete with conventional and patented seeds. But if the main objective of conservation varieties is to protect biodiversity and to enable local and sustainable agriculture, I just simply suggest to remove this limit from the Council directives. The second option is more procedural, and it aims at addressing the administrative obstacles that were identified as problematic. So namely the cost and the necessity to describe the main features of a variety that can often not be described according to the required criteria. I couldn't find a single good reason in the scholarship to maintain such a requirement. And so I suggest to abandon altogether the requirement of registering official conservation varieties in a list. The use of such varieties should just be easy and flexible, and it is not compatible with a formal procedure. In conclusion, given the fact that biodiversity loss might well have participated in the current pandemic, it may sound a little ironic to suggest biodiversity protection measures as a possible path to follow. But as Dr. Sultana underlined, everything is linked. Food chains are globalized, globalization participates in biodiversity decline, and it is strongly suggested that biodiversity loss increases the risk of future global pandemics. As a result, it is now even more important than ever before to break the vicious cycle and to relocalize our food chains in order to stop food production from being detrimental to the environment, and also in order to make sure that the quantity of food available locally is sufficient to avoid other scenarios such as the one that took place in the spring of 2020 and that could have been much more dramatic. I do believe that seeds in general and conservation varieties in particular offer a great potential in this direction, but that the legal framework should be modified in order to enable them to develop their effective potential. The good news is the EU has recently announced that the EU seed regulation, including conservation varieties, will undergo an entire legal reform in the years to come. So we'll see if this process brings about satisfactory solutions. Thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to further discussing these questions with you.
Thank you so much, Camille, for your wonderful and inspiring presentation. And you made me think of what we could call an appeal that the Food and Agriculture Organization has made, and it was stressed to be a very crucial challenge for us all. And the Food and Agriculture Organization had stressed that it was fundamental to bridge the knowledge gap in relation to the food production system and biodiversity. And you really embrace this very important and challenging aim. Your research is so inspiring and so innovative, and it was really a pleasure to hear to your presentation, to listen to your presentation, and to all the very innovative and stimulating proposals and ideas that you have developed and that you have shared with us today. So again, thank you so much, Camille.
Thank you.
Now I have the pleasure to introduce to you Beltrán Fuentes Cortiña from the University of Santiago de Compostela. Beltrán's presentation today is about eco-design for a circular economy. Welcome, Beltrán. We are so happy to have you here with us, and when you wish, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in this wonderful colloquium organized by my great colleagues of the CEDAT. Today I will speak about circular economy and ecological design of products. First of all, I'm gonna share my presentation. Share screen. See it now. As I was saying, I'm going to talk about eco design and circular economy, and I would like to begin posing a question, which is it possible to change the current model of massive production and consumption? We know that the present model of massive production and consumerism is not sustainable at all, and it leads us to a situation like this one: the huge ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal like 2 months ago. Our current economic model leads us to these situations as long as it promotes a huge production of goods, of products that need to be distributed and consumed all over the world. So the thing we may ask is it possible to limit this economic model? This image is like a symbol of the economic model, economic system we have nowadays. So is it possible to limit this system or to change this system? Sometimes we can, or in a first view, we might think that environmental law usually is not enough to change the economic system of massive production and consumers. Like just the same as it happened with this small machine that tried to move the huge ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. But today with my presentation, I'm gonna try to show how the huge ship can be changed or can be moved. In other words, I'm gonna try to show how the economic system of massive production and consumerism can be changed. To do that, one of the biggest strategies that has been launched in the last years, especially by the European Union, is the circular economy strategy. The circular economy strategy is opposed to the linear economy model, which is the traditional and even the current one, which consisted in taking the materials from the nature, making new products with these materials, and when we just consumed the goods and we don't need the products more, we just dispose the products as waste. So this needs to be changed. And the circular economy proposed not only to reduce all the waste that we produce, but especially to reduce the amount of waste that we produce. And to do that, to prevent the generation of waste, we need to design better products in order that the products last longer, are easy to repair, easy to reuse, and so on. So circular economy does not only affect waste, but especially affects production and consumption of products. So these are the three main areas where the circular economy affects. But as I have just said, the real revolution or the real systemic change needs to be done acting in the production and consumption phase. And this is closely linked to eco-design, ecological design of products. So what is eco-design and how it works? Well, eco-design is a way of design products that integrates the environmental aspect or the environmental consequences of these products in their whole lifespan, in their whole cycle. So these eco-design requirements or rules are ruled in the European Union by a framework directive, which is the Eco-Design Directive, which establishes the main aspects of the requirements, ecological requirements also, that have to be complied by the products that the producers put in the internal market. So this Eco-Design Directive has two big limitations, because it only applies to energy-related products. The main goal of this directive is to promote energy efficiency of products, but it does not cover the materials efficiency, which has more to be with repairability of products, durability of products, reuse of products, and these kind of aspects that are more related with the circular economy. Well, once we have the Eco-Design Directive, then approved by the European Parliament and the Council, then the European Commission can approve, it has approved around 30 eco-design regulations for specific products categories. For example, there's a regulation for lamps, there's another regulation for washing machine, and so on. These regulations approved by the Commission can be also substituted by voluntary agreements achieved by the industry. Well, so how the circular economy strategy affects eco-design? What is the change proposed by the circular economy strategy in the eco-design law? Well, the circular economy proposed to produce products that last longer, that are more durable, that are more repairable, that are more easy to repair, and that are more easier to reuse. So the rules that the circular economy strategy introduced in the eco-design law are rules for promoting the durability of products or combating plant obsolescence, for the repairability of products, I mean to ensure the right to repair the products, and for promoting the reuse of waste. Focusing, now I'm going to focus in the first and in the second kind of category of rules, because they are the more relevant for the circular economy. For example, when we talk about the new rules that the circular economy strategy introduced for the durability of products and for combating plant obsolescence, this can refer to different kind of rules. For example, in France, the French state has introduced a new criminal penalty to plant obsolescence, and the French prosecutor has investigated Apple and some other big companies to induce or to induce their products to last shorter than they should last. But maybe regulating this by criminal sanctions is not the best way, because the application of this is very limited and it would need greater efforts. So more interesting is to look to the new durability conditions that have been introduced in the Directive 2019/771 on contracts for the sale of goods. This means that a new condition, the condition of the durability, has been introduced as a condition for the conformity of the products between the seller and the buyer. So the buyer can ask for the responsibility of the seller because of the non-durability of the products. The problem is that this condition has not been regulated with a lot of precision. Then another important kind of measures are the new eco-design requirements that have been introduced in some regulations for specific product categories that have been approved in the last years, especially in 2019 and also this year, 2021. These kind of measures, for example, are the prohibition of firmware or software updates to worsen the functioning of the device, or even some measures to promote repairability, because if we can repair our product, we don't need to substitute it for another product, so it can last longer. So this is linked to the next slide. Measures to promote the repairability of products and to guarantee, to ensure the right to repair. How we can ensure the right to repair products? Or how, what kind of measures the European Commission have been implementing to ensure this right? Measures to ensure disassembly, because if we cannot disassemble the parts of the product, it's impossible to repair it. The obligation to provide spare parts during a minimum period of time. In the last regulation, this period is 10 years. Also the obligation to share information with independent repairers for the reparation of products. So, coming back to the question posing at the beginning of the presentation, is it possible to change this model of massive production and consumerism? Well, the thing is, we are not close to achieve it, but as I have shown during my presentation, there are some measures that can be implemented, and not only they can be, they also have been already implemented by the Commission. The problem is that they don't have the ambition enough. Sometimes they don't have a great scope, because they only apply to very specific categories of products. We have also seen in our research how sometimes the industry has achieved to reduce the ambition of some regulation. For example, the Commission and some environmental ONGs wanted to prohibit the commercialization of lamps that are not repairable. But then, so this was in the first draft of a new regulation for lamps. But at the end, this first draft was modified because the industry didn't want to include this change. So at the end, the final regulation does not include this obligation to put in the market only lamps that can be repaired. So just to conclude, I just say that yes, it is possible to change this model, but the European institutions and the national states and the nations worldwide need to implement more and more ambitious measures on that. So this was all. Many thanks for your attention. I am here for to answer every question you have. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Beltran, for your wonderful presentation. It was so interesting and so appealing how you made us explore how the European Union is, yes, it is trying to overcome its traditional approach towards energy-related products, but at the same time, we see this sort of contradiction between the ambition to improve its legal framework, its tools, and at the same time, some kind of pressure from the industry. And so an ambition that is strong, but at the same time, listening to all your ideas, learn from you, those very inspiring and those very advanced, innovative ideas on how the European Union could finally effectively improve its approach and implement a really effective framework that is fundamental if we really want to cope with the current challenges and the massive challenges that are soon expecting us, for a very long time as well in the decades ahead. So I guess there will be many questions for you, and thank you so much, Beltran. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
So now we are moving from the regional dimension of the European Union to the closest dimension that we can know and experience in our daily life. And I mean the urban dimension, the urban context. So I'm very happy now to introduce to you our next panelist, Javier Francisco Arenas Ferro from Universitat Rovira i Virgili. And today, Javier Francisco will share with us his research on scavengers, urban metabolism, and strategic litigation as transformative and recovery response to planetary emergency. Welcome. To your presentation. So when you wish, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Simona. It's always difficult to be the last one because people are tired. So I promise I will just talk 11 minutes and will respect this time. This presentation aims to describe and analyze the concepts created by the Colombian Constitutional Court related to waste management, waste pickers as environmental actors, and their potentialities to promote their work and knowledge in the actual circumstances. For this purpose, in the following minutes, I'm going to relate the COVID-19 pandemic, the urban metabolism, and difficulties related to the regulator's capture, which causes a lack of representation and encourage litigation strategies. After this, I'm going to address aspects of the argumentation provided by the court, and I will point out some of its potentialities. The planetary crisis is urban. ONU Habitat has projected that in the following decades, more than 70% of the world population will be urban, which means a rural displacement toward the cities as well as a higher population concentration. Although they occupy about 3% of the planetary surface, settlements concentrate the use of resources, energy, and also waste generation. Insofern, the urban metabolism is where the majority of greenhouse gases are caused and where more garbage is generated. At the same time, they concentrate population, infrastructure, and facilitate human rights compliance. The Anthropocene has to focus. which is understood as a geological transition due to the human behavior and consumption patterns that corresponds to a patriarchal cosmology. The migration to cities has been seen as an opportunity for life improvement, but many of them suffer the consequences of the pandemic. At the same time, they endure social exclusion by the economic order. At least those of the so-called Global South contain slums and poor neighborhoods, which will be crowded and can become poverty traps due to the lack of public policies aimed to encourage people capacities. They are example of a lack of public planning to empower the population to overcome this situation and their vulnerabilities. This relation between the environmental crisis and the urban phenomena has also been recognized at the international legal level. For example, to achieve mitigation and adaptive responses to the ecological crisis, the 2030 Global Environmental Agenda and the Paris Agreement emphasize goals that are related to the sustainable cities. This explains why the majority of the national determined contributions, NDC, aim to urban policies. They condense opportunities and also dynamics that should be transformed and developed as strategies to overcome the challenges that the pandemic in the environmental crisis requires, among which is the economic reactivation under sustainable considerations. In this context, settlements provide environmental and social difficulties, but also opportunities that reveal an increase under the COVID-19 pandemic. Any strategy to propose a transformative and recovery response to it has to consider this as a starting point. The urban context presents particularities. In the Global South, poor people have crowded marginal areas, the so-called sacrifice zones, which are places that suffer the consequences of environmental injustice. This means they bear the inequitable burdens of the social metabolic reef and suffer the consequences without sufficient reparation or even any non-repetition guarantees. Population among them have survived thanks to their activities in the informal economy and assembled in economically active groups, which can be understood as private initiatives. They can be characterized by the circumstances of discrimination survived by their members. For instance, in Barranquilla, a city in Colombia, waste pickers were murdered and their bodies sold as a commodity for medical students. They were considered disposable and were named desechables. But also, they can be characterized by the environmental struggles they commit as part of what has been called popular environmentalism. One of them is the scavengers or waste pickers. They derive their daily income from recycling and through their work reduce the environmental impacts of the urban social metabolism and take part in a social and solidarity economy. Before the pandemic, the complexity of urban social environmental dynamics has caused conflicts that can be solved in a short time. As part of the capitalistic production system, they reproduce asymptotically and continue developing in time. The environmental injustice caused by the linear waste management police will continue through generation. They include leachages and disease vectors, but also greenhouse gases and foul smells. They have been called environmental successive conflicts. For example, the future health disease caused by today's pollution will be part of them. Waste management can also be part of these kind of conflicts, and even the atmosphere transformation due to its impact on the future environment of generations of human and other species. Therefore, it is central to plan responses related to waste as an alternative in the main environmental successive conflicts, the Anthropocene. This should be state's obligation. The traditional theory of power division and democratic representative principles states that the parliament and the executive order are responsible and competent for any public policy, while the judicial review should be relegated to control their behavior only if their actions don't comply with the legal and the constitutional system, which includes poverty eradication and environmental politics related to sustainable development. A pragmatic critique that has been raised against this approximation is the existence of the regulatory capture, which means that those powers have been co-opted by corporate interests and refrain from acting for public behavior and wellness. But social movements don't remain passive under these situations. One of their strategies is public litigation. Despite they can redirect and conduce sometimes public policies under these kind of conflicts, the resolution of these controversies through law is always temporal. So they will rise again under other circumstances. And indeed, there have been many opportunities in which the waste speakers organizations have filed lawsuits before the judges. In the last 2 decades in Colombia, some of the waste speakers have developed strategic litigations to defend their labor rights and have achieved success. Their claims are related mainly against discrimination policies and have been addressed by the Constitutional Court more than 70 times. In its jurisprudence, the court has created an environmental discourse that encourages public policy to promote their work as environmental actors. This because it provides adaptive and mitigation tools that manage environmental impacts, generates welfare, and reduce poverty. 2 constitutional main arguments were developed as part of the decisions: the equal right principle and the environmental sustainability obligations. For this purpose, the court recognized the metabolic urban difficulties of the waste management policy and the importance of the waste speakers organization to reduce the environmental impact, but also the linking between the state's obligation to promote work and the prohibition towards their condition due to the discrimination they overcome. So one of the orders involved the recognition of affirmative actions in their behavior. The focus was their work as a public good because of its importance as environmental management of the waste cycle. Because of this, the court considered them as environmental subjects of constitutional protection, mainly because their work is involved in an efficient circular waste management cycle. So they are an important chain link to environmental impacts mitigation. They could be understood as microorganisms that help the urban metabolism to reduce its matter and energy demands. So the discourse recognizes an economically active group that was discriminated against because of its work and living conditions, and highlights the environmental impact reduction thanks to them. It established future states' obligation to include waste speakers organizations in any policy related to waste management. Finally, the narrative made in the jurisprudence can also be used in future development of this conflict that has gotten worse because of the pandemic. This type of discourse is ecological, and social justification could be used to promote such responses in public policies, not only in this country, but also in other places. It comprises argumentative tools for political environmental actors that incorporate political perspectives of links between the city's demands and the necessities of the living world beyond an anthropocentric reduction. They relate human work, environmental justice, and environmental efficiency, which are central to promote responses to the actual eco-social crisis. Their environmental core, this link between human work and environmental benefits, can also be used in the defense of other groups that favorably affect the environment due to their social economical dynamics. So this was my presentation. Thank you very much. Y un abrazo solidario a todas las personas que están resistiendo en Colombia contra un régimen opresor. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias a ti, Javier Francisco, for your wonderful presentation that was so inspiring, and you have approached a very sensitive and crucial dimension, a very crucial context, that is the urban dimension. So it is the reality that we experience in our daily life constantly, and it is also the reality, the context when we can really promote our own engagement for improving our conditions and our situation. And your approach is so original, so impressive, and I really loved how you addressed the experience of the scavengers and also the engagement of the Colombian Constitutional Court. For example, in Italy, in a different situation, the circumstances were a bit different, but a few days ago, a very important ruling was adopted, and it was related to the so-called Ilva case that was also analyzed, and the case was also brought to the Strasbourg court some time ago. And it was a major step ahead towards environmental protection and the protection of the communities that are affected in such an unparalleled and important manner. So it was actually also the very important step ahead of the community. And your presentation has been so inspiring for us all. So thank you so much. And now all presentations have been amazing and so thought-provoking, so stimulating. So we're looking forward to reading all your questions and to get you all engaged with us in the reflection about environmental law and current critical challenges. Now I would like to invite all our speakers to please turn your cameras on so that we can be closer and all together now for the debate. So I see that probably our attendees are thinking about their questions now. We can possibly give them a few minutes for thinking about your questions. So maybe in the meantime, as our attendees are thinking about the questions that they would like to ask to all of you, may I have a question for Camille? Thank you so much, Camille.
Of course.
Well, I would like to ask you if you could expand even a bit further on what the European Union is planning and thinking to do for the moment. We've seen with Beltran how in a different context in relation to circular economy and eco-design, the European Union, well, in a very complex situation, but is doing efforts for trying to overcome the criticalities with upsides and downsides. So I would be very happy if you could. So thank you so much, Camille.
Thank you. Yes, so the first thing to say is that regulation around seeds is never really transparent. Like, it's always very hard to know what's going on. So I don't have a clear-cut answer of what they're planning to do. We're never too sure because there are a lot of competing interests, economic interests, political interests. So we're not quite sure, but what seems to be the general direction is that for a long time, productivity was the only objective of food production or agriculture. And seed regulation was just this tool to produce large quantities of food. And now we're beginning to realize that environmental protection, social aspects of food production are also important. So we're trying to go back a little bit and include those different aspects in the legislation. So at least I can tell you what the Swiss authorities are planning to do. They're planning to try and have two seed systems, a formal seed sector that mostly follows the rules that I've presented, and then try to open the system a little bit to enable a different type of agriculture and a different type of seed production, seed selection to take place that, whereas it is now completely prohibited. So I think everyone or most people now agree that the system is too strict, but how to improve it without, because it's not deregulation is not really an option because there are other imperatives such as sanitary measures. Like, we want to make sure that the seeds that are sold are of good quality, that they don't carry illnesses. So a certain set of regulation is necessary, but how to open the regulation so that it includes other aspects, but still protects those health, it's called health measures or sanitary measures. So how to combine them with opening the system. I think that will be the main challenge, but thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Camille. Thank you so much. And I see that probably, well, still we have no questions for the moment. Okay. So Well, maybe okay, see that by now we have no questions yet, no more questions yet. And well, for example, Javier Francisco, would you like to, curiosity, to maybe tell us something more about the approach that the Colombian Constitutional Court has been developing in general from a broader perspective? In relation to
yes, the jurisprudence has, you can find more than 70 different kinds of decisions, but mainly you will find these two kind of arguments, big arguments. One related to equal rights, and two different spheres. One, the active sphere, that means that, and then the negative sphere. This one means that the state has to respect some kind of limits, and the other one, the active one, means that the state has to be active and to promote opportunities so people can overcome the historical difficulties they have lived and survived. That's why also this concept of intersectionality is so important. And the other one is the environmental argument. And this is a very interesting argument because it's where the court develops the idea of metabolism, of social urban metabolism, to talk about the work of people like an opportunity to reduce our social impact for the environment. So I will recommend everyone that is interested in urban metabolism and also in garbage and waste and in recycling to read these decisions of the Constitutional Court of Colombia.
Thank you so much, Javier Francisco. And Farana, if I may, I saw that you were nodding, so if I can, I would be very happy to know your perspective, your ideas, if you would like to share with us your view about this very stimulating debate that we have had all together. So thank you so much.
I was nodding to Javier's, sorry, were you saying something? No, okay. I was just nodding to Javier's in terms of metabolism. So if we think about the use of natural resources or human labor that goes into producing goods and services, there's also the waste and the disposal, right? So garbage studies and discard studies come into this. But the part of the thing that's driving the collective destruction is that consumption habit. So we have hyperconsumption that's driving a form of ecological metabolism and social metabolism that's producing these wasteful lifestyles that is being encouraged. And we're seeing those kinds of exploitations of ecological resources that's bringing more, biodiversity loss, but then also more zoonotic transfers or spillovers from human wildlife habitat contacts, more destruction of indigenous forests or rainforests and so on. So if we're thinking about the waste, we need to think about where the waste is coming from and then both ends, right? So the disposal of the waste is causing all kinds of problems. And I think this is what's really come to the fore in this last year, that if we want to think about different types of harms and injustices, there's this underlying kind of ideologies that tend to drive it. And a part of it is that kind of hyperconsumption, which is effectively driving climate change, as opposed to the convenient and often racist tropes of overpopulation. That has been quite debunked by scholars for some time. We need to look at the way different forms of policies and consumption of lifestyle and travel and mobilization of agricultural goods and products and other goods and products lead to those destruction, and then therefore the production of the waste that needs to be disposed. So, we have the cycle of crises that's led to this. And I think this is where a lot of people are starting to question or think about what drives this. How do we decenter these kinds of capitalist ideologies of endless growth.
Thank you so much, Farana. So now I see that we have a question from Facebook that again is for you, Farana. And the question is, how could indigenous knowledge be transmitted to Northern societies to cope with the pandemic and the global crisis? Thank you so much.
All right, so that's a big question, so I'll answer it fairly quickly, and it won't be satisfactory. So that's the caveat. So there's a lot of scholarship in indigenous studies around the world, not just indigenous studies in the Americas or in settler colonial context, which is where they become more taught or talked about or institutionalized. But if you look at the ways that histories of imperialism and colonialism have destroyed indigenous cultures and lifestyles and entire systems and ways of knowing, I think one of the ways we can transmit that knowledge is to first start these critiques, to start to critique the Eurocentric assumptions that drive global hegemony. Because until you decenter Eurocentrism, you're not going to really have those kinds of conversations that we need to have to center more indigenous knowledge. And indigenous knowledge, again, is not homogeneous, right? There's a variety, and not all of it will transmit, because a lot of it is place-based or context-based or tied to the land and the ecosystem. But it's that, I think for me, to think about decolonizing knowledge means to change up what we teach, how we make policy, who's at the table, not just who's at the table, but who made the table, who create the terms and conditions of debate. So if we want to think about transmission of indigenous knowledge, to help with pandemic or climate recovery, first, we need to have those kinds of, understandings of much better ethical research praxis, decentering what we think is knowledge and what is devalued as knowledge globally. And that requires, what a lot of decolonial scholars call cognitive justice. And we need to stop that kind of epistemic violence that's been reproduced over centuries in terms of valuing life and other cosmologies, but to think about, pluriversality or conviviality, to change up the kind of the capitalistic or destructive ideologies of just demand and supply, but to kind of have different forms of relations with one another and with the earth. And there's a lot of scholarship out there. So it may not be specific to specific types of post-pandemic or climate just recovery, but there's a lot we can learn from what's already existing around the world. It's a question of how do we change up institutions and structures that have maintained a form of global hegemony, Eurocentric capitalist hegemony.
Thank you so much, Farana. I think that Javier Francisco has raised his hand.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I wanted to say that also related to this importance of knowledge and who validates knowledge as something important or something that can be a tool for the society. And one aspect of the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court is that it highlights the knowledge of the waste speakers. It says it's a value and it should be promoted by the state because they know how to work with waste. And because of this, for example, a society should go so often to nature to exploit resources. It could use some of them that are recycled. So, and this discourse is also linked with international laws. For example, in the case of indigenous people, the Convention for, es que me acuerdo en español, la Convención sobre Biodiversidad.
Rights of Mother Earth?
No, it's about this. It's for
Biodiversity Convention.
Exactly, that one. See, it talks about the importance of indigenous knowledge to protect biodiversity. So, and if you look, for example, in the Paris Agreement, you can also see some, and also in 2030 agenda, you can also see some discourses related to knowledge of other groups, of other people. And one of them are precisely these waste speakers, but could also be the peasants that live near the city and can help to protect some environment that is near the city.
if I can just add something, it's interesting that you're mentioning the Biodiversity Convention, because this reference to indigenous knowledge was added after a century of the North using resources in the global South, and like resources being on one side of the globe. I mean, natural resources being on one side of the globe, financial resources to exploit the natural resources were on the other side. And at some point, there was this idea that natural resources should be part of the common heritage of the world or humankind. And it was finally, the idea was finally abandoned because the South vetoed it, because they said it would actually defeat the purpose why it was made, and that it would actually give the tools to the West to exploit resources in the global South. So it's really interesting how this argument can actually go both ways. Yes.
Thank you so much, Camille. And I would like to ask to our speakers if there's any other idea that you would like to share with us all. We would be very happy. So here I can read that Stephanie Asensio is making her compliments to all the speakers. She said that it was a wonderful panel and all presentations were wonderful. And really it was a very enlightening and a very inspiring session. So unfortunately, I see that we're running out of our time. But before closing, I would really love to thank all our speakers. It's been such an honor and such a joy to have all of you with us. And it's been amazing to share all these wonderful ideas and to engage all together in such a stimulating debate. So I would also like to thank all our attendees. Thank you so much to all of you for being with us. And I would really like to thank the Tarragona International Environmental Law Colloquium Organizing Committee. My very special thanks to all of you. I've been so honored and so happy to be the moderator of this section. And I would like to thank so much all the colleagues who are working on the technical support on all the technical issues. We can see you physically, but you can see all the amazing, wonderful job that you're doing, and with so much passion and with so much devotion. So my very special thanks. So we are looking forward to welcoming you tomorrow for the third session of the Tarragona International Environmental Law Colloquium that tomorrow will start at 16:30. So I wish I will have the chance to meet all of you in person very soon. It's been an honor and a big pleasure to meet all of you and to have all of you, all our attendees with us. So thank you so much again to all of you, and see you very, very soon. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.